Hi everyone, it's Mr. Cinti, and thanks for tuning in. Today I'd like to talk to you about how plants can respond to the environment, and in particular they respond to the environment in this discussion to the light, in something called photoperiodism. And just the bigger idea before we go into detail, the bigger idea is that plants in order to survive have to be sort of cognizant, if you will, sort of metaphorically cognizant of time passage. So in other words, like seasons passing, um, temperature, these sorts of things are really crucial because it'll affect when's the best time for certain plants to flower. So as you may be familiar, plants can flower. Some plants flower in some seasons, some do in other seasons. And this is a discussion today about how plants can determine when to flower. And in a previous video we talked about when seeds will germinate, but it's basically this. Well, let's get into it. Let me just click over here. So there's an appropriate appearance of seasons. Seasonal events are critical in the importance of a plant, and so plants respond, and this is what it's all about. This is they adjust their physiological responses. In other words, their flowering or their seed germination based upon environmental stimulus. And what's the most important environmental stimulus for seasons changing? It's going to be the light. And so this is called a photoperiod. It's the relative length of day and night. And you're like, well, wait a minute. Is that really the case? I thought the length of the day and the length of the night was the same. No, in fact, it does change. And so the midway point of a 24-hour day is 12. But in the spring, depends on really where you are. But in the spring, the day is a little bit longer and the nights are a little bit shorter. In the winter, just the opposite of that. It's a little bit of a shorter day, a longer night. And so this is called photoperiod. And so plants respond to photoperiod in a process called photoperiodism, such as flowering. And so this particular conversation today is really focused around how plants use the photoperiod to employ photoperiodism, which will result in flowering. And so one of the early, just a little history, because I think this is kind of interesting, tobacco. I'll tell you, so many things have been learned in botany from tobacco. I think it's one of our favorites because it's such an important economic crop that we like get all riled up when things aren't working right. And so in the early 1920s, botanists started to discover there's mutant strains. I think it's Maryland Mammoth, this particular variety of tobacco that wasn't flowering just like the other ones, and so there was a mutant variety, as I mentioned, and it didn't flower in the summer like normal tobacco plants. It flowered in the winter, so kind of an oddball. And so it leads you to believe that there must be some kind of genetic control, there must be some sort of physiological response, there might be a hormone or a pigment involved in this since there was a mutation. And it led scientists on an interesting journey to actually determine what is it about a plant that it knows, like how does tobacco even know that it's summer? How does it? And then this particular variety only flowers in the winter, so that's kind of weird. What's the story there? So you can put plants in these are not tobacco plants, but you can put plants in a growth chamber like this where you can regulate the amount of light that they get. In other words, you can control the length of day and night or photoperiod in one of these light chambers. Pretty cool. So you could sort of, make, like for example, they can discover that the variety would only flower, this mutant one, if the day length was 14 hours or shorter in this particular mutant, which kind of explained why it didn't want to flower in the summer. And so, well, what is it then? What's actually causing it? Well, as it turns out, a group of scientists, and then at this point, in the 1930s, started to describe beyond tobacco that there's groups of plants that they called short day plants. Short day plants because it required a period shorter than the critical length to flower. Examples of this would be chrysanthemum, poinsettias, and even some soybean. And then they started noticing that other varieties of plants flower only when the light period is longer. And so they called them long day plants and short day plants. An example of a long day plant would be like spinach, or iris is sort of the icon. We always talk about chrysanthemum and iris and some cereals as well. And then there's some plants, kind of the whole spectrum here, that kind of disregard photoperiod, and so they're day neutral. And so they flower regardless of the length of the day. And so as another decade goes by, so the 1940s, and this is an important thing because scientists have been calling these plants short day plants and long day plants, but as it turns out, and this is a really critical point right here, so researchers discovered that it's actually the night length that is most important, that determines flowering. So those short day plants actually flower because of a long night, and those long day plants actually flower because it's a short night. And so it's not the day length, it's the night length that causes photoperiodism, or flowering in plants. And so as it turns out, this was discovered, and as the things are in botany and in biology in general, and you're familiar with this, sometimes the terminology gets entrenched in the literature, and it's hard to undo it, and so we just kind of go with it. Sort of like photosystem 2 occurs before photosystem 1 in photosynthesis. So short day plants, let's look over here. A short day plant actually requires a long night for it to be able to flower, and so chrysanthemum is an example of this. So do you see here, it's flowering? It flowers because it's a long night. So think of it this way, it's a long night. So if it's a short night, it does not flower. Here's 12 days, here's the 12 hours, here's the full day. And so check this out. If you interrupt, and this is kind of important because it needs to be continuous darkness, if you interrupt the night with a flash of light, and it can even be a short one, if you interrupt it with a flash of light, it perceives that as a short night, and therefore it will not flower. Isn't that interesting? And then over here, the iris, again, it's considered to be a long day plant, but really it's the short night that's causing the iris to flower. And so it needs a short night. So if you interrupt it with a flash here, it thinks it's a short night, and it will also flower. And so here's a beautiful picture of a Douglas iris right here. So it happens to be a long day plant, which is actually, if you're following this, it requires a long day. It really requires a short night for it to work. And so it works, it flowers on photoperiods that are short nights. And so the chrysanthemum requires a long night for it to grow, and it's a short day. So check this out. What do you make of this this experiment? So like I was mentioning before, notice here the iris, it requires a short night, and the chrysanthemum requires a long night. You see that? But then check this out. When you shine, this is red light. When you shine red light at the plant, what you're doing is you're interrupting the length of the night. So it's no longer a long night, it's considered to be a short night. And so what the iris interprets is that it's a short night, and it starts to flower. But then check this out. When you shine the red light, and then you follow it up with a little flash of far red light, remember that mechanism that we were looking at before when we were talking about in the previous video about plants being able to adjust? And so check this out. What does that suggest to you, that if it's reacting to far red, red, far red, red? So the very last flash of light is what it's using to sort of judge this. So if the last one's red, or if the last one's far red, well, as it turns out, when you're considering this, you may have concluded that it might be involved. Phytochromes might be involved, because it's the phytochrome, which is that complex of the protein kinase and the pigment embedded in it, and so it's able to sort of oscillate back and forth. And so red and far red lights are able to turn on and off the flowering mechanisms. So I think that's kind of interesting. It's sort of photoreversible, if you will. And so, when you're looking at this, the measures of the night length are very important. And they have to be kind of accurate, because it turns out that the short day plant won't even flower if it's like 1 minute shorter than a critical length. Isn't that interesting? And that some flowers will basically are so sensitive that they only flower on the same day each year. I find that kind of interesting. And so humans, though, are aware of this mechanism of photoperiodism. So we can actually cause some plants to flower out of season. You're like, well, how can we do this with these flashes of light? So one of the most important days of the year for flowers is Mother's Day. And so a favorite flower for mothers is chrysanthemums. And so what we can do, and chrysanthemums kind of out of season when it comes to blooming or flowering in May. And so what we could do is flash light at them and cause them to flower whenever we want them to flower. It's kind of interesting. And then finally, one of the things that's kind of interesting about this is that you can take a portion over here, like, of course, flowering involves like a bud becoming from a vegetative bud to a flowering bud, but what's actually picking up the light are the leaves. And so those phytochromes are present in the leaf. And so what's interesting is, even if you shine a portion of the plant with light, the whole, if you look down here, the whole plant will flower, even if this portion's kept in the dark. And you're like, well, what's up with that? Well, it's connected right here. You have this little device linking these two separate plants even together, which is suggestive of what? If light is coming down here, for example, and it's causing flowering to occur over here, you might be thinking, I wonder if there might be some sort of chemical message that's traveling across over here, which is causing flowering to occur. So this is suggestive that flowering is caused by photoperiodism, but it's also controlled by hormones, or if it isn't one hormone, it's maybe two hormones, or a relative concentration change in those hormones. So it's fascinating overall. Plants are able to determine the length of the night by picking up cues and using pigments to do that, and then transport messages throughout the plant to cause flowering or make physiological adjustments through the use of hormones and signal transduction to amplify the signal. So in conclusion, so whatever the environmental cue is, whether it be temperature or carbon dioxide, or in this case light, what's actually causing these beautiful flowers to occur is that there's a transition between as I mentioned before, the bud meristem to become from vegetative to flowering. So it's a complex combination of genes, environmental cues, hormones, and pigments that pick up the light from the sun. And so I hope you enjoyed that conversation today that we had on photoperiodism and flowering. Thanks for watching.